The airport buzzed with activity as travelers moved briskly across polished floors. Announcements echoed over the intercom while occasional bursts of laughter from families embarking on new adventures filled the air. Among the sea of passengers, Janelle Bennett stood out, not because she sought attention, but because of the quiet confidence she carried. The polite and composed teenager stood tall, clutching her first-class boarding pass. Her excitement about this flight was tempered by her natural shyness. This journey wasn't merely travel, but a celebration of her academic achievements. She had recently won a prestigious scholarship to continue her education in the United States. Dressed in a sleek yet simple outfit, Janelle made her way to the exclusive first-class lounge. The space, with its plush leather chairs, ambient lighting, and soft jazz playing in the background, offered a sanctuary of comfort. While seated in the lounge, Janelle noticed two flight attendants standing near the service counter. One of them, a woman with sharp features and a tightly wound bun, glanced in her direction. Melissa Harper, the lead flight attendant, exchanged a smirk with her colleague. "They're letting just anyone into first class these days," she muttered under her breath, her voice carrying an air of superiority. Her colleague chuckled nervously but said nothing. When the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Janelle adjusted her carry-on and made her way toward the gate, joining the first-class line. Stationed at the entrance to the plane, Melissa scanned each passenger's boarding pass with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard," she said warmly to an older white man in a tailored suit. To another woman holding a designer purse, she chirped, "Enjoy your flight." When Janelle reached the front, Melissa's demeanor shifted noticeably. She scanned Janelle's pass, her eyes narrowing. Though the ticket clearly read first class, Melissa plastered on a tight smile. "Oh, economy is just down the aisle," she said, pointing toward the back of the plane. Janelle blinked, surprised. "This pass says first class," she replied, holding it up. Melissa's expression remained fixed. "There must have been a mistake. You should head to economy." The warmth in her voice was artificial, the underlying message clear. "You don't belong here." Janelle's grip tightened on her carry-on, but her voice remained steady. "There's no mistake. This is my seat in first class." As passengers behind her shifted impatiently, Melissa leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Look, I don't want you to cause a scene. Just head to economy so we can keep things moving." Refusing to back down, Janelle stepped onto the plane, her posture unwavering. She walked to her assigned seat in first class and placed her carry-on in the overhead bin. The cabin was immaculate, with spacious seats and a calming ambiance. She settled in, adjusting the window shade slightly. Moments later, Melissa Harper returned to the first-class cabin. A seasoned professional known for her no-nonsense demeanor and sharp eye for detail, her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she approached Janelle's row. Her expression remained unreadable behind a mask of professional politeness. Stopping in front of Janelle, she raised her hand slightly to get attention. "Excuse me, young lady," Melissa said, her tone firm but measured. "First class is reserved for paying passengers." Janelle's breath caught momentarily. She glanced down at her boarding pass, then back at Melissa. "I am a first-class passenger," she replied, her voice steady despite her discomfort. "Here's my boarding pass." She held it out, expecting the misunderstanding to be resolved immediately. But Melissa didn't take the pass. Instead, she crossed her arms and gave Janelle a skeptical look. "I don't think so," Melissa said dismissively. "Please step aside while I handle this." The words struck Janelle like a physical blow, a wave of disbelief washing over her. For a brief moment, she sat frozen, unsure how to respond. Around her, murmurs began as nearby passengers took notice. Some exchanged pitying glances, while others whispered among themselves, their expressions revealing curiosity or quiet judgment. Janelle could feel their stares burning into her, each glance a sharp reminder of the humiliation unfolding before her. Melissa took a step closer, her voice growing sharper. "Let me see your ticket again. Are you certain you didn't accidentally take someone else's pass?" Janelle's fingers trembled slightly as she held out the ticket once more. "It's mine," she said quietly, her voice firm despite the lump forming in her throat. Melissa examined the ticket, her expression betraying nothing. Instead of acknowledging the clear evidence before her, she let out a skeptical scoff. "This is my ticket," Janelle repeated, her voice now carrying a quiet strength. "It's not a mistake. My father purchased it for me." Melissa raised an eyebrow, her tone laced with doubt. "Your father? And where is he now?" "He's waiting for me at our destination," Janelle answered. Melissa glanced around as if seeking validation for her disbelief, her eyes flicking between the ticket and Janelle's face. "I'm going to need to verify this," she said curtly. "Wait here." As Melissa walked away, Janelle sat motionless, a knot of humiliation tightening in her chest. Passengers continued to whisper among themselves. Some looked at her with pity while others wore judgmental expressions. Not a single person stepped forward to question what was happening. The sting of isolation was sharp, but her father's words echoed in her mind. "Always carry yourself with dignity, even when others don't." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself of who she was. The daughter of a man who had built an empire from the ground up. A man who taught her that respect was something no one could take away. A few minutes later, Melissa returned, her voice deliberately louder than necessary. "Excuse me," she announced, ensuring everyone nearby heard. "I need to ask you to move to the economy section. This seat has been assigned to someone else." Several passengers turned their heads, curious about the commotion. Janelle calmly reached for her boarding pass again, holding it up without a word. "But this is my seat," she said firmly. "How can it be assigned to someone else?" Melissa's polite mask slipped as she crossed her arms. "If you don't comply, I'll have to escalate this and call security." The tension in the cabin thickened as the standoff between Janelle and Melissa intensified. Whispers spread like wildfire among the passengers, creating a divided atmosphere. A businessman leaned toward his companion, muttering, "Looks like someone's trying their luck." Across the aisle, an older woman frowned, her expression disapproving. "This doesn't seem right," she murmured. Not everyone sympathized with Janelle. A man seated a few rows back commented, "Well, if she doesn't belong here, the attendant has every right to question her." Melissa, determined to assert her authority and unwilling to back down, took the ultimate step. She called for security. Minutes later, 2 officers boarded the plane, their presence adding a new layer of tension to the unfolding drama. They approached Janelle's seat, their expressions professional but firm. Janelle remained calm as she explained the situation, her voice steady. She showed them her boarding pass, defending her right to sit where she belonged. Despite her valid evidence, Melissa's narrative prevailed. The officers deferred to her authority. "Ma'am," one officer said, his voice low but authoritative, "we've been asked to escort you to another seat." Janelle met their gaze, her voice unwavering. "This is my assigned seat," she said, holding up her boarding pass. "I have every right to be here." The officers hesitated, glancing at Melissa for confirmation. She nodded sharply, her expression one of vindication. "Her seat is in economy," she said firmly. Despite Janelle's valid ticket and composed protests, the officers escorted her to economy. The whispers and stares of passengers followed her down the aisle. Though humiliated, she maintained her composure, walking with dignity to her reassigned seat. Back in first class, Melissa returned with an air of triumph. She walked through the cabin with a satisfied smile, her voice carrying just enough to ensure she was heard. "That's how you handle troublemakers," she said to a fellow flight attendant. Then, glancing around at the passengers, she added smugly, "First class is for people who belong here." In economy, Janelle sat with her posture upright and her expression composed. Outwardly, she appeared calm, but inside, frustration gnawed at her. She glanced down at her phone, where an unsent text to her father remained on the screen. "This isn't right, Dad. Why didn't they believe me?" She hesitated to send it, knowing her father would act immediately and likely not subtly. Every skeptical glance and dismissive remark felt like a reminder, "You don't belong." But she refused to let those feelings consume her. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself of her father's words, "Always carry yourself with dignity, even when others don't." Meanwhile, in first class, a fellow flight attendant quietly questioned Melissa about her actions. "Why did you treat that girl like that?" Melissa's response was smug. "She thought she could just walk in and claim whatever she wanted," she scoffed, her voice carrying just enough for nearby passengers to overhear. "It takes experience to see through that kind of nonsense. I had to put her where she rightly belongs." A few passengers chuckled politely, but others exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that her words were anything but professional. Seated in economy, Janelle did her best to maintain her composure. Despite her efforts, the weight of the humiliation she had just endured settled heavily upon her. Her first-class ticket, the proof of her rightful place, now felt like a cruel joke. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed a message to her father. "Dad, they moved me to economy. The flight attendant claimed my seat was a mistake." Victor Bennett's reply came almost instantly. His messages were short and to the point, but they carried an unwavering sense of reassurance. "Stay calm. I'll handle it. Let me know if anything else happens." Janelle stared at the screen for a moment, drawing strength from her father's steadfast support. Taking a deep breath, she slipped her phone back into her bag. For now, she would wait, trusting that her father's intervention would come at the right time. A little while later, she got up to stretch her legs and headed toward the bathroom at the back of the plane. As she waited, a soft voice spoke behind her. "I saw what happened earlier." Janelle turned to see an older woman who had been seated in first class. The woman's kind eyes were filled with concern, and her voice carried a mix of empathy and quiet indignation. "That wasn't right," she continued gently. "You didn't deserve to be treated like that. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." For a moment, Janelle was caught off guard by the unexpected kindness. She managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I appreciate it, but I'll be okay." The woman nodded, placing a gentle hand on Janelle's arm. "You're handling this with such grace," she said, "more than most people would manage." With an encouraging smile, she returned to her seat, leaving Janelle with a small measure of comfort amid the injustice. Back in first class, Melissa was still basking in her perceived victory. She leaned against the galley, her voice carrying as she spoke to her colleagues. Her co-workers exchanged uncertain glances, their expressions growing increasingly uneasy as they listened. Some passengers who overheard her boasting whispered among themselves. A few shook their heads in silent disapproval, but no one spoke up directly. Melissa remained oblivious, her confidence swelling. "Honestly, I'm doing them a favor," she said with a smug laugh. "It's about maintaining standards. If we let just anyone in, it's chaos." Meanwhile, Janelle sat in the cramped confines of the economy section, trying to maintain her dignity. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her breathing steady, but inside frustration bubbled just beneath the surface. She stared out the small window at the endless expanse of clouds, trying to distract herself from the gnawing sense of unfairness that had followed her since boarding the plane. After a few moments of reflection, she decided to do something simple that would shift her focus, even if only temporarily. Janelle pressed the small call button above her seat, the soft chime barely audible over the hum of the plane. She leaned back slightly, waiting patiently for someone to approach. Several minutes passed. She watched as flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, tending to other passengers with quiet efficiency. Yet none of them came to her row. Finally, she spotted Melissa making her way toward the economy section. The flight attendant's polished exterior remained intact, but there was an unmistakable edge to her movements as she approached. She stopped abruptly by Janelle's row, her voice sharp and devoid of warmth. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped. Janelle looked up, meeting her gaze with quiet politeness. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" she asked, her tone measured and calm. Melissa's response was immediate but curt. She offered a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sure," she said, before turning on her heel and walking away without another word. Janelle waited patiently, but Melissa never returned. Instead, she watched as the flight attendant carefully served drinks to other passengers, her smile warm, her gestures deliberate. The intentional nature of the slight wasn't lost on Janelle. She pressed the call button again, this time more firmly. The soft chime echoed in her ears, an almost mocking sound underscoring her growing frustration. Minutes passed before Melissa finally returned to the economy section. Her movements were slower now, almost reluctant, as she approached Janelle's row. Her expression carried a tinge of annoyance, barely concealed behind a forced smile. "Yes?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to make a few nearby passengers glance up. Janelle kept her voice calm, though it took effort. "I requested water earlier," she said. "Can I get it now?" For a moment Melissa said nothing. Then her lips curled into a tight, insincere smile. "I'll get to it," she muttered dismissively, barely glancing at Janelle before turning away, making it clear she had no real intention of fulfilling the request. Without giving Janelle a chance to respond, Melissa disappeared back toward first class. Janelle's calm facade began to crack. The deliberate hostility was unmistakable now. The sting of humiliation settled deeper in her chest as she glanced around. Did anyone else notice what was happening? Were they ignoring it? Or was she truly alone in this? Her eyes dropped to her phone, the screen still glowing with her father's earlier message. "Stay calm. I'll handle it. Let me know if anything else happens." She tapped the screen, her fingers moving with quiet urgency as she began typing. "Dad, the flight attendant is targeting me. She's deliberately ignoring my requests and making me feel unwelcome. It's becoming unbearable." Janelle stared at the words for a brief moment before pressing send. The finality of her action brought both relief and frustration. Her father's reply came almost immediately. "Stay where you are. I'm making the call now." The message was short but carried weight. Janelle knew her father wasn't one to let things slide. If he said he was making a call, he meant business. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself once more. She couldn't help but glance around, wondering if any of the other passengers had noticed the way she was being treated. Her eyes caught a few sympathetic glances, but nothing more. The silence of their inaction felt almost as isolating as Melissa's behavior. Janelle's thoughts were interrupted by quiet movement nearby. A young girl, also seated in economy, approached her. Her expression was kind, but filled with quiet determination. She leaned in slightly, her voice soft yet firm. "That flight attendant is always terrible to any black person she sees," the girl said, her voice tinged with quiet outrage. "She treats us like we don't belong here, like we could never afford first class. That kind of behavior shouldn't be tolerated." Janelle blinked, her composure faltering slightly in the face of the girl's sincerity. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. The young girl nodded in understanding before returning to her seat. Midway through the flight, as the plane cruised above the clouds, the steady hum of the cockpit was interrupted by the sound of the secure line ringing. The captain, a seasoned professional with years of experience, picked up the receiver. His expression was neutral at first, his eyes instinctively scanning the instruments. But as the voice on the other end spoke, his demeanor shifted. His brows furrowed slightly, and his posture straightened. The voice on the secure line belonged to Victor Bennett, the owner of the airline. Despite his calm and measured tone, there was no mistaking the authority behind his words. His instructions were clear and deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. "Yes, sir," the captain responded, his voice steady but now carrying a new weight of urgency. "Understood." The conversation was brief, lasting no more than a minute, but its impact lingered long after the call ended. As the captain placed the receiver back in its cradle, he exhaled slowly. When someone like Victor Bennett made a call mid-flight, it wasn't a casual inquiry. It was a direct intervention. Without hesitation, the captain activated the intercom. "Head flight attendant to the cockpit," he announced. Melissa arrived promptly, her usual confidence still intact. However, as she stepped into the cockpit, she sensed the shift in atmosphere. Her carefully constructed narrative about handling troublemakers suddenly felt flimsy and inadequate. The captain's expression was grave as he spoke. "Mr. Bennett has instructed me to inform you that he will be meeting the plane personally upon landing. He expects an explanation." He let that sink in before adding, "And from now on, he wants you to take care of his daughter well. You are to treat her with the utmost respect and professionalism for the remainder of this flight." For a moment, Melissa stood frozen, her mind racing. The words rang in her ears like an alarm, loud, piercing, and impossible to ignore. Her pulse spiked, her throat went dry, and a cold sweat formed at the base of her neck. For the first time in her career, she had no control over what came next. "I didn't realize," she stammered, her usual sharpness replaced by hesitation. The captain's expression remained firm. "That's irrelevant," he stated plainly. "What matters is how this situation was handled." Melissa's bravado cracked under the pressure. She nodded stiffly, her throat dry as she managed to utter, "Understood." As the captain returned to his duties, Melissa remained rooted in place. Her hands trembled at her sides, her breathing uneven. The confidence she had displayed throughout the flight was now a distant memory. She muttered under her breath, almost as if trying to reassure herself, "I'm sure it's nothing." But her words lacked conviction. The unease gnawed at her, growing stronger with each passing minute. For the remainder of the flight, Melissa's demeanor was noticeably subdued. Her steps, once brisk and purposeful, became slower and more hesitant. The smug remarks that had flowed so freely earlier were now absent, replaced by tense silence. Passengers who had observed her earlier behavior couldn't help but notice the drastic change. Some exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Something had shifted, and as the flight continued, one thing became clear. Melissa Harper was no longer in control. She lingered near the galley, gripping the edge of a counter as she fought the growing panic in her chest. Her hands were clammy, her mind racing, searching desperately for a way out. Finally, after a long, shaky breath, she made a decision. If she could just make it up to Janelle, maybe, just maybe, she could salvage the situation. Swallowing her pride, she grabbed a tray and made her way toward Janelle's seat. Her heart pounded with every step. Stopping beside Janelle's row, she cleared her throat awkwardly. "Miss Bennett," she finally forced out, her voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard, her hands twisting together. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for earlier. I know I was wrong. I didn't mean for it to." She stopped herself, realizing that any excuse would only make things worse. Janelle studied her for a moment, her calm demeanor unshaken. Then, with measured words, she replied, "The matter is no longer in my hands." Melissa blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "My father is handling it now," Janelle continued, her tone steady but firm. "He's the one who will decide whether or not you're forgiven." Melissa's face fell. The confidence she had clung to throughout the flight evaporated in an instant, replaced by an overwhelming realization her fate was no longer in her hands. Janelle, without another word, turned her attention back to her phone, signaling that the conversation was over. Melissa stood there for a moment longer, her thoughts racing, before retreating to the galley. Other passengers who had been quietly observing the tense exchange whispered among themselves. Some exchanged knowing glances, while others shook their heads, having witnessed firsthand the injustice Janelle had faced. For Janelle, however, the situation was now clear. She had endured humiliation and hostility, but the balance of power had shifted. As she gazed out the window, a faint smile crossed her lips. This was only the beginning. When the plane finally landed and taxied to the gate, passengers gathered their belongings, eager to disembark. Through the windows, they could see a sleek black SUV pulled up beside the aircraft, its polished surface gleaming under the airport lights. A uniformed driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Victor Bennett emerged, his presence unmistakable. He wasn't just another passenger. He was the airline's owner, and he was here for one reason. Inside the plane, whispers started immediately. "That's Victor Bennett," someone murmured. "He owns the airline." Victor ascended the steps, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the metal stairs. The moment he stepped inside, the air seemed to change. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Flight attendants stiffened. Passengers exchanged glances, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. His gaze scanned the cabin before settling on Janelle. His expression softened as he walked directly to her. "Are you all right?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge of concern beneath it. Janelle nodded. "I'm okay. It's just been a lot." Victor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over now. You won't have to deal with this any longer." Straightening, his warmth faded, replaced by an air of quiet authority. He turned to Melissa Harper. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "I understand there was an issue with my daughter's seat." Melissa's face drained of color, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. She opened her mouth, but no words came, only a strangled breath. "The issue," Victor continued, "is not whether you knew she was my daughter. The issue is how you treated her, and how you likely treat others who don't meet your assumptions." The cabin, silent moments ago, erupted in applause. Passengers clapped, their approval of Victor's words echoing through the space. Some nodded in agreement while others exchanged satisfied glances. Victor turned to the airline executives who had accompanied him. "Effective immediately, Miss Harper is to be removed from duty. Her behavior today does not align with this airline's values." As Melissa was led off the plane, murmurs filled the cabin. Some passengers shook their heads in satisfaction, others exchanged knowing glances. Justice had finally caught up with her. In the weeks following the incident, the airline wasted no time addressing the situation. Beyond policy changes and corporate decisions, one thing was clear. Justice was not just about punishment, it was about change. And sometimes, change starts with one person standing their ground. The training program implemented afterward wasn't just a formality, it was rigorous. Employees were challenged to confront their biases, reflect on their actions, and learn from real-world cases of discrimination. Role-playing exercises forced them to step into the shoes of passengers who had been mistreated, while guest speakers shared first-hand accounts of the deep and lasting harm caused by prejudice. More than just a requirement, the program became a wake-up call. Employees were reminded that their job wasn't just about customer service, it was about upholding dignity, respect, and fairness for every passenger who stepped onto their planes. Meanwhile, Melissa Harper had been dismissed immediately following the incident. The initial sting of embarrassment was sharp, but over time, it transformed into something deeper: shame, regret, and an unshakable realization of how wrong she had been. She had spent years in the airline industry, confident in her authority, but had never stopped to consider how her unconscious biases shaped her behavior. The moment she saw Janelle that day, she had made an assumption, one that led to her public downfall. One evening, seated at her kitchen table, she opened her laptop. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard before she began typing a long and heartfelt email to the airline. "I can't undo the harm I caused," she wrote, "but I can acknowledge it. I am deeply sorry for how I treated Miss Bennett, not just for my actions, but for the mindset that allowed me to believe they were acceptable. I want to do better, and if given the chance, I would like to prove that I have changed." When Victor Bennett read the email, he saw genuine remorse in Melissa's words. After consulting with his team, he made a decision. She would be given a second chance, but only under strict probation. Her behavior would be closely monitored, and one misstep would mean immediate dismissal. Humbled, Melissa returned to work not as the same flight attendant, but as a woman determined to make things right. She took the training seriously, often volunteering to share her own mistakes with new hires. Over time, her colleagues noticed a transformation. She went out of her way to ensure that every passenger, regardless of background, felt valued. For Melissa, this wasn't just about keeping her job. It was about becoming a better person, a journey of self-reflection that would ultimately change her perspective on service and dignity. While Melissa worked on her personal transformation, the incident itself had sparked a much larger conversation. Weeks after the event, Victor Bennett addressed the media in a press conference. Standing before cameras, he spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had built his airline on principles, not privilege. "Inclusion is not optional, it is a responsibility," Victor stated, his voice steady but passionate. Privilege comes with duty. Whether it's the privilege of serving as a flight attendant or the privilege of sitting in first class, we all have an obligation to treat each other with dignity and respect. His words struck a chord with the public far beyond the confines of the press conference. The sincerity and directness of his message, combined with the power of his position as an airline owner addressing his own company's failings, resonated deeply. Within hours, video clips of his statement had spread across social media platforms, igniting a nationwide conversation about discrimination in the service industry. The story of Janelle Bennett's experience resonated with countless individuals who had faced similar treatment but lacked the platform or power to address it. Hashtags like Inclusion Matters, Respect for All, and Flying While Black dominated social media for weeks. People from all walks of life began sharing their own stories of discrimination while traveling, stories that had previously gone untold or unheard. Major news networks quickly picked up the story, featuring interviews with travel experts, civil rights advocates, and industry insiders. One prominent morning show hosted a panel discussion where several passengers of color shared their experiences of being questioned, relocated, or treated with suspicion while flying first class. "What happened to Janelle Bennett isn't an isolated incident," noted Dr. Maya Richardson, a sociologist specializing in racial bias in customer service. "It's a manifestation of deeply ingrained biases that affect how service workers interact with customers of different backgrounds. The difference here is that someone with power witnessed it and took action." The conversation expanded beyond air travel to encompass all aspects of the service industry. Luxury retailers, high-end restaurants, and hotels found themselves under increased scrutiny as more people came forward with their experiences. Consumer advocacy groups called for industry-wide changes, including mandatory bias training, anonymous reporting systems for discriminatory treatment, and clear consequences for employees who violated anti-discrimination policies. Several organizations published customer bills of rights that outlined what consumers should expect regardless of their appearance or background. Even competing airlines issued statements affirming their commitment to equitable treatment, though industry insiders noted that Bennett Airways, as Victor's company came to be known in the media, was setting a new standard that others were scrambling to match. The most unexpected development came when a coalition of flight attendants from various airlines formed an advocacy group called Service with Dignity. Their mission was to promote inclusive practices within their profession and provide resources for service workers to recognize and address their own biases. "We became flight attendants because we wanted to care for people," explained their spokesperson, "but many of us were never taught to examine how our perceptions might affect the way we treat different passengers. We want to change that from within." 6 months after the incident, the ripple effects continued to transform the airline industry and beyond. Bennett Airways' training program became a case study in corporate responsibility. The airline opened its training facilities to educators, researchers, and even competitors, sharing their methodology and results in the spirit of industry-wide improvement. The program's success was measurable. Customer satisfaction scores across all demographics had risen significantly, and employee retention had improved as staff reported feeling better equipped to handle diverse situations. The airline saw a 27% reduction in formal complaints related to discriminatory treatment, and internal surveys showed that passengers of all backgrounds reported feeling more welcome and respected. Other companies took notice. Within a year, similar training programs were implemented across multiple service industries. Hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and even healthcare facilities adapted Bennett Airways' approach to their specific contexts. The incident also prompted regulatory changes. The Department of Transportation established new guidelines requiring airlines to report incidents of alleged discrimination and detail their remediation efforts. These reports became public record, creating accountability and transparency previously lacking in the industry. Several law schools added the Bennett case to their curriculum, using it to illustrate the intersection of corporate policy, individual bias, and civil rights. Business schools similarly incorporated the case into their ethics and management courses, highlighting how leadership's response to discrimination could transform organizational culture. For Melissa Harper, the journey of redemption continued. After completing her probationary period, she was invited to join Bennett Airways' training team, where her first-hand experience became a powerful teaching tool. Her candor about her mistakes and subsequent growth resonated with employees in a way that theoretical discussions could not. "I never saw myself as prejudiced," she often told new hires. "I thought I was just doing my job, maintaining standards. It took losing everything for me to realize that what I called standards were actually assumptions based on how I thought people should look or act. That realization changed everything for me." The most significant change, perhaps, was the most subtle: the normalization of seeing diverse passengers in premium spaces. As more airlines actively worked to create inclusive environments, the sight of people from all backgrounds enjoying first-class service gradually ceased to raise eyebrows or trigger assumptions. 2 years after the incident, a prominent business magazine featured Victor and Janelle Bennett on its cover for a special issue on corporate ethics. The accompanying article detailed how one painful incident had catalyzed meaningful change across multiple industries. When asked about her thoughts on the lasting impact of her experience, Janelle, now a poised college student, reflected thoughtfully. "What happened to me was painful, but the change it created has been remarkable," she said. "My father always taught me that respect isn't just about how you're treated, it's about how you help ensure others are treated right, too. If my experience helped make travel more equitable for everyone, then something good came from something bad." Victor Bennett's company had become known not just for its exceptional service, but for its unwavering commitment to dignity for all passengers. Applications to work at Bennett Airways soared, with many candidates citing the company's values as their primary motivation. At the industry's annual awards ceremony, Bennett Airways received recognition for outstanding contribution to industry standards, an acknowledgement that their response to a single incident of discrimination had permanently raised the bar for how airlines should treat their passengers. As Victor accepted the award, he kept his remarks brief but powerful. "True luxury isn't about exclusive access. It's about ensuring that everyone who walks through our doors, regardless of appearance, background, or circumstance, receives the same respect, dignity, and excellent service. That's not just good ethics. It's good business." For Janelle, watching her father from the audience, the moment felt like the closing of a circle. What had begun as a humiliating experience had transformed into a movement that changed not just one flight attendant or one airline, but an entire industry's approach to service and inclusion. On her most recent flight, seated comfortably in first class, she had noticed something remarkable: the diversity of passengers around her and the consistent respectful treatment they all received. No raised eyebrows, no questioning glances, no assumptions about who belonged there. This, she realized, was the true measure of change, not just policies or training programs, but the quiet normalcy of equality, where exceptional service was delivered to all passengers without question or hesitation. Leaning back in her seat, she let out a quiet breath of satisfaction. Change isn't easy, but it is always worth fighting for.